On today's World Insight, the Davos Forum is about to commence. How can Davos be a tool to solve global challenges? And how will the Davos Forum reinvent itself for its 50th anniversary? Tian speaks to David Aikman, the World Economic Forum's Chief Representative Officer in China, to find out more.
We need to pull the leaders together and to say, let's focus on the areas where we need collaboration, where we need global standards for safety.
If you realize how much the world has changed and how anxious we are about uncertainties, you will not be surprised by the coming showdown in the snowy Swiss mountain village of Davos. Participants are from all corners, teenage environmental activists to state leaders, billionaires to futurists. I will be there too at the 50th edition of the World Economic Forum to bring you all the latest. Let's see if we really have the guts and the resolve for a cohesive and sustainable world.
And here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. The World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos will begin on January the 21st, the last until the 24th. Yet the 2020 event is significant for two reasons. First, it will mark the 50th anniversary of this prestigious gathering, and it comes at a time when the global markets are entangled in trade concerns, digital risks, and geopolitical uncertainties. That explains why priorities for this year's forum include technology, geopolitics, ecology, and trends in industry. Let's take a look.
From above, it looks like just another quiet town in the Swiss Alps. For 1 week, every January, though, Davos is essentially taken over. 1,000 or so of some of the world's biggest companies paid big bucks to set up shop in the town centre. Following them soon, some 250 political leaders, including US President Donald Trump. Security here is intense. The World Economic Forum gets underway on Tuesday for the 50th time. From the Gilets jaunes in France to demonstrations in Chile these past 12 months, there is a groundswell of anger from those who say they've been left behind by globalization. Then there's the climate protests, seemingly a separate issue. But what links the two is a joint sense that the gap between citizens and their leaders has widened. Protests haven't really featured at previous forums. This time could be different. In the build-up, Greta Thunberg has been calling for demonstrators to keep the pressure up outside the conference hall. Thunberg will be topping this year's programme inside.
The truth is, if you want to get the world's leaders into a room and bang some heads together and get the messages heard loud and clear and walk away with some kind of solid deliverable actions, then it's not a bad idea putting them into a small town, but it's very, very hard for them to escape from.
Escape they eventually will, though, on Friday afternoon, when we'll find out whether all the talk of action this time will be anything more than just that.
For more on the Davos gathering, we'll speak to, from London, Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darendorf Forum at the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Shanghai, Mr. Jimmy Zhu, chief strategist at the Fullerton Research. In Beijing, Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Much expectation as to what World Economic Forum this time can achieve, given it's such a time of tremendous changes. Professor Begg.
Well, yes, Davos always looks to be the point in the annual calendar where some of the more difficult issues at least get confronted. They don't often get solved at Davos. But the important thing is people keep talking, and that's maybe one of the advantages of having a forum like Davos, is to bring people together rather than having them throwing things at each other from a distance.
Mr. Zhu, of course, one of the biggest issues is whether the stakeholders, as being indicated this year, of the world will be able to come together to brainstorm and be able to come up with solutions. Now, these stakeholders are very wide, according to the World Economic Forum this year particularly. Mr. Zhu, do you think there's common ground?
I think one of the main concerns for this year is still the trades, especially at this moment. U.S. and China just reached a phase one deal, and currently, I think the good thing is compared to the past 2 years, lots of business uncertainty seems like to got a chance to take an ease, since two sides are willing to make concessions, at least for the truth at this moment.
Professor Liu, as we know, it is not a stage for China-U.S. trade negotiations, but rather a stage to talk about global issues, Professor Liu, all intertwined.
Yes, I think now this round of Davos has painted a bleak landscape about everything that is going on in the world, and particularly with regard to environmental degradation, economic stagnation, and the geopolitical division and possibly confrontation. So the logic is really to alert the world that united efforts are critically required for multi-stakeholders to work together towards a sustainable and cohesive world that can really better the environment and also the people.
Professor Beck, I have to borrow your history experience in a way, because, you know, at a time of dramatic changes, whether human beings, stakeholders as we say, will be able to proactively approach one another and try to be apathetic rather than just being selfish. It's a big question mark, isn't it? This Davos World Economic Forum is certainly a test of that.
Yeah, very, very much so. And the advantage of a place like Davos is when major decision makers are in the same place, they can at least look into each other's eyes and see whether they have a disposition to deal with the problems. There are many stakeholders, as you say, likely to be represented in Davos, including a large number of younger people this time round. And that's an opportunity for the next generation to talk to the current generation. In particular, as we heard the other day, the world is warming faster than ever before, so that's something that really has to be top of the agenda. The big challenge is, can you convince someone like Trump that it really is a threat and not something he can dismiss so airily?
But when it comes to long-term businesses, Mr. Zhu, you are coming from business yourself. Will they be self-disciplined? Now, at this moment, social media, for example, many of those companies that are having huge social media platforms are being asked by the society to be self-disciplined, even though there are questions coming from society and government. But is it possible?
It's possible. That also depends on how the regulators play in the field. And we noticed that actually there's a lot of listing companies, if they not meet those kind of requirements, probably they will receive some penalties from the exchange regulators. So I think everyone needs to work together on this part.
I'm not sure whether that is the case yet, Professor Begg.
Well, maybe not the case yet, but there's one thing that can often be critical, and that is the point of view of customers of these companies. If you're a customer of a company you perceive to be dirty, you are going to be more hostile to it if you think that it needs to do something much more extensive about environmental questions. A recent example is that BP, the large oil conglomerate, is in trouble with consumers in Europe because it's seen as not doing enough to promote cleaner energy, and it's become something of a pariah in its support for example, cultural activities. Museums and others are turning down grants from the likes of BP, just as they did recently over the opioid crisis in the US with the big pharmaceutical companies there.
So you're saying a top-down approach is not the way to go, but rather at this moment, citizens of the world have to act on their own. It's more a bottom-up approach that would work. Professor Beck, is that what you're trying to say?
To some extent, yes, but it's also movements. If the people, however we define the people, are saying to the corporate world, we no longer expect or tolerate you doing the things that we don't agree with. Companies have to react. And we've seen this before where sometimes there's something known as the California effect, where higher environmental standards became a source of competitiveness rather than something to detract from competitiveness.
This is really your field, Professor Liu. I mean, but there's one word Professor Beck used. If companies are being perceived as not meeting the standard. Now, when you are being perceived, there's a degree of precision as to whether you are really doing it or only being perceived so. So, Professor Liu, how do you see, in a way, the informed society could play in all of these issues that we've been talking about, and the fact that these days it's more passive reading than proactive reading, if you look at the popularity of social media and how messages are being pushed to every reader around the world?
Well, to respond to what you asked about the discipline, I think there are, I always propose two types of CSRs. One is corporate social responsibility, and the other is citizen social rights. So they are contradicting, but they form a ecosystem of the business world with the consumer and in consideration. As for the perception, people now say perception is reality because you constantly bound on the table and send to people's ears, and even mask people's eyes with irresponsible news, irresponsible stories and perspectives, and that's something very scary, because merely relying on regulators, that's not enough, and that's also very costly. So it does require the general awakening of the people in the public, but of course the eternal discipline and competition is important for the most positive and for the most truthful ones.
It is not the very first time, not the second time, but repeatedly people have been talking about the problem of facts versus fakes. Mr. Zhu, do you see that as a fundamental issue we are facing now, no matter which issue we are talking about? Political leadership, economic growth rate, or sustainable development responsibilities and social responsibility, all of this, facts versus fakes.
Probably, I think for now, because we are it seems like we are living in a very diverse world. I mean, lots of the different countries, even the different sectors, seems to have the different opinions. So sometimes in some certain, in one facts, probably we have lots of elaborations. Sentiment seems like drive the world. So it's also in this event. I mean, we can also take this advantage for the business leaders, policy makers, like how to synchronize the language, can make the world to synchronize with and communicate with each other much better.
Language probably is not the only issue here. Having said that, though, Professor Beck, I want to go to you once again. It's not just economy, not just business world, but the geopolitics. People say this is a juncture of change, but we only see symptoms of changes. We have not seen structural changes, and particularly conscious structural changes. Professor Beck, how far are we going to lag behind the real changes?
Well, it will vary according to the dossier you're looking at. I think there is now a growing awareness of the necessity of action on climate change, but you still have the fact, and this is a fact, not a fake, that the world is increasing its output of carbon, not diminishing it. And there are major challenges, particularly for some of the emerging markets, in getting away from carbon-emitting energy production towards alternatives. You've seen the process of change in China. It's not really happening yet in India, which is another emerging market likely to be a major contributor to global carbon emissions. So that's one dimension of this. But in other areas, such as thinking about how to regulate some of the power of the social media companies, I detect a groundswell trying to say it's time for change. They cannot continue to allow some of the things that generate fake news. And as an aside on that, there is an interesting observation for you and other journalists, which is that generating and reporting facts is expensive, creating fake news is cheap. And that's one of the dilemmas that we have to face in regulating the flood of fake news.
And also about geopolitics as well, Professor Beck, if I could follow up. We have seen the rift of the members of so-called the West countries. United States with its European partners. You are coming from the UK. Right now you're based in the UK at least. So how do you see the visible divisions among these countries and yet lack of courage to make the change so that there will be important goals that can be achieved, Professor Beck?
Well, there are clearly big and difficult questions around, a lot of which come back to just one person, Donald Trump, because his erratic approach to international relations means that he's very unpredictable, and that creates his own tensions. Now, some say that his unpredictability is in fact an asset, because it means that countries like Iran, which seek to challenge him, can't really be clear what his response will be. The same with North Korea. Russia is a stabilizing influence to some extent, but also a provocative influence in some areas. Europe, you would say, punches beneath its weight in global matters. And one of the ambitions of the new European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, is to try to increase the weight with which Europe punches in global matters. So we are on the cusp of some changes, but I don't think anybody can really tell you at this point where they're going to lead.
Mr. Zhu, is that what you have found? Is the problem really Mr. Trump, one person?
I think probably it's not because of, not Trump caused the thing. Of course, he has a lot of things actually a bit make the world a bit unpredictable or uncomfortable. But I think one of the things is probably the social media we're talking about is really grow so fast, because we are living in a world in past few years, the pace is much faster than in the past 10 years. So that's the reason of we saw the growing numbers of the social media, and it's kind of, I'm not very sure about other countries, but in some major countries I know probably on the regulating on the fake news or real news, probably there's not much clean line. So I think that's also the different countries share with the different languages and the cultures. So I think if that's the case, probably there will be some misunderstanding to come out, which is quite normal.
Cyber governance, of course, Professor Liu, is a big issue. There's a huge difference in how different governments and countries are doing that job and with what standard, Professor Liu. And that is not just one issue itself, because it's paved the foundation for many other divisions that we have seen in geopolitics, economy, society issues, many. So, Professor Liu, how do you see that? As a fundamental issue.
Yeah, cyberspace has really opened a new world and new window opportunity for people on this planet. But in the meantime, there are a lot of uncharted areas and unregulated areas that people need to be aware of. So given all the positive contribution to economic growth and to people's coming together in better communication, but how we can really go to those fundamentals to respect the basic human rights, privacy, and business secrets, and in the meantime to utilize it in a positive way, like e-commerce and responsible social media. And these are really the questions that can be deeply discussed at Davos, so that we can really come up with some tangible solutions.
We've been deeply discussing them many times. No solution, Professor Beck, only more differences in terms of how governance is being done.
Well, there are solutions on the table. You may be familiar with something called the GDPR, the European approach to data protection. That could become a global standard, but it does require other major regions of the world, particularly China and the US, to adopt the same kind of philosophy, to say, as Professor Liu said, data privacy is significant. Who owns data? Are the data that are held by companies about me and you and others mine or theirs to use as they dispose. These are major challenges which I think governance is having to confront in the cyber area.
Right.
And maybe it needs a big international convention on it to try to work out the way forward.
Another elephant in the room, gentlemen, we haven't mentioned is what's going to happen to the two largest economies if we didn't count EU, because EU is an entity rather, into the picture. China and the United States. Many are very concerned whether there's going to be new Cold War or whether there's going to be even hot war or conflict. Mr. Zhu, how much do you think those issues can be further analyzed at the World Economic Forum? And by the way, that's likely also to be the theme of the rest of the year, Mr. Zhu.
The good news is we reached some truths as mentioned earlier, but the bad news is at this moment the visibility is still very low. Based on the partial deal existing, what we see is that they're demanding on 200 billion buying in the next 2 years. Probably China needs to pick up another 50% for each year compared to the buying from US in 2018. So it's very difficult to say whether the tariff will be or the tension probably will come back again in some certain point in this year. But I believe that in order to achieve that, improving the domestic demands in China also very important, because that seems that the easiest way to achieve those targets by US.
Professor Liu, it's believed that President Trump might also select another opportunity to visit China later this year. At least that's what he indicated. Having said that, though, he's going to be there in Davos at the World Economic Forum if he goes as promised, because he promised last year he didn't go either. But anyway, Professor Liu, how much do you think the rest of the international community can do in order to avoid a new Cold War?
I think a consensus is required, particularly at this critical moment, for the rest of the countries to get really concerted actions against protectionism and defend the multilateral trading platform. And so China is really working very closely now with EU with regard to investment facilitation, and China is also very much involved in the RCEP negotiation, trilateral free trade agreement between China and Japan and South Korea. So I think now China does really present a good example, and so the whole theme of Davos is cohesiveness and sustainability. So every country has to act in a more responsible way to contribute to cohesiveness and sustainability of the world, which is really risking fragmentation and protectionism.
Well, if they will. Professor Begg, what's your thought?
Well, there are ways in which Davos can help, notably by putting relevant people in the same room. For example, one major challenge this year is going to be how to deal with the crisis in the World Trade Organization because of the dysfunctionality of the appellate body. That has to be solved. As has already been said, China, Europe, Australia and others and India are working together to try to find an alternative form of dispute resolution. That can make progress.
Ian Begg.
A delicious possibility could...
Ian Begg, Jimmy Zhu and Liu Baocheng, thank you so much for joining us. You're watching World Insights. Still to come on our program. How will the World Economic Forum reinvent itself for its 50th anniversary? I speak to David Aikman, the WEF's chief representative in China, to find out more.
We get leaders to step out of their daily business and look over the horizon, lift their heads up out of the business and look for the longer term.
Welcome back. I'm Tian. You're watching World Insight. It's another year where the world's political and business leaders are crowding into the snow-covered Swiss mountain town of Davos. This year's theme of World Economic Forum is Stakeholders for a Cohesive and Sustainable World. Now, on its 50th anniversary, the annual Jamboree is expected to be a bigger affair, addressing the most pressing realities of our time. Earlier, I spoke to David Aikman, the WEF's chief representative in China. He explains how Davos, after 5 decades, still remains relevant at providing solutions for a changing world. Let's listen in. What a pleasure to have you on CGTN.
Thank you.
Another year of Davos, but very different this time. 50th anniversary. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
There is one question. When we talk about 50 years, World Economic Forum was very relevant at a time when the world has been changing so fast over the past 5 decades. But what about from now on, as the world is changing in a very different logic, and the World Economic Forum is based in Europe? So how is it going to make it relevant?
Well, I think one of the ways the World Economic Forum has been relevant for the last 50 years has been to always be ahead of the curve. The reason why we hold the annual meeting in January is because we get leaders to step out of their daily business and look over the horizon, lift their heads up out of the business and look for the longer term. And I think that's one of the things that's really helped us with our relevance. And now as we look to the next 50 years, what we see is the need to really renew business's mandate with society. And that's why we've created the theme this year around the stakeholders theory, coming back to our origins, if you will. Because 50 years ago, our organization was founded on the notion that all of the stakeholders of society need to work together to improve the state of the world.
I have to question, because now people even find it difficult to know what's going to happen in 5 days. Not to even mention 5 months, 5 years, or even 50 years. So how would a place like a World Economic Forum, where is the energy of thinking is coming from over the past decades, continue to play that role? It's just a big question mark to me.
At the origin, back in 1973, in our 3rd year of operation, we launched something called the Davos Manifesto. And we're bringing it back again this year, which is looking at business's role in society. Because we feel that although over the last decades, business has really profited, society is not doing so well. Many of the fragments and cracks that we've been talking about for the last 5 or 6 years are now reaching fracture zones. It's like a tectonic shift. It's a state of emergency. It's a state of crisis. And if we don't do something to redress the balance, particularly around economic inequality and around climate change, we are in big trouble, not just for the next 50 years, but for the next 5 years. So we feel a real sense of urgency of bringing the leaders together and renewing that mandate with society to look at how capitalism and globalization can serve society, not just the business interests. For
a kid like Greta, she has to speak out in order to make sure that her future will be not devastating. In a way, it's awkward, isn't it, for the World Economic Forum, because the World Economic Forum hasn't achieved that, some would argue. David?
We've been calling for years about this problem. I think Klaus Schwab, our founder and executive chairman, started talking about the economic inequalities and the dangers of globalization back in 1996. And so, it's our job to focus the attention of leaders and to really get them to pay attention to this. After that, it's up to governments to pass laws. It's up to companies to change their standards. And what I'm encouraged about this year is the fact that we've got so many different leaders who are ready to commit to these new standards. They're ready to sign up for these new ESG principles. We are hoping that over 100 countries are going to be announcing new rules on trade facilitation to try and fix some of the cracks in the current trade system. So we're really looking for those tangible commitments, and it's our job to then hold people accountable year on year.
What is that trade facilitation issue is likely to be? How are economies going to commit to that?
One of the things we've seen, the challenges with the current trade system is it doesn't necessarily have the right guidelines and standards in place for digital trade and the trade of e-commerce and so on. So there's been a huge initiative over the last 2 years between the World Economic Forum, the WTO, and some of the big e-commerce giants worldwide to see what can be done to improve this environment. And so we're hoping to be able to announce some positive steps there.
The U.S. president committed to come to Davos last year, didn't show up. Now, how is the World Economic Forum prepared for all options?
You know, it's always a challenge for us with Leaders' Agenda. I think this year, for example, we bump right up against Chinese New Year, which makes it much more difficult for our Chinese participants to join. So we always have these scheduling challenges, and as world and domestic events spring up, sometimes leaders do have to cancel their participation. But this year we have over 60 heads of state engaged, 280 public figures, and oftentimes what we find is we have strong delegations with all of the key ministers from trade, from commerce, from the economy, from science and technology, environment. So even if a given leader is not able to participate in one year or due to circumstances, we still have delegations which can do that important work. And as I said, you know, so much work takes place in the closed-door meetings where we really want things happening at the working level. So
sometimes getting a room to have a meeting is a problem.
It is a challenge. Davos is a small resort
Yes,
that doesn't
exactly.
have the right infrastructure. But you know, the wonderful thing about Davos, and you know, it's grown up with the World Economic Forum over the last 50 years, is in such a small village, people are really forced to be together. They sit on the shuttle together, they ride up in the cable cars together, and that personal human contact is very important.
Nothing could replace that, in
No.
fact. Yeah. Another thing, the World Economic Forum falls this time after possibly China and the United States signed the first phase of the trade deal. Now, we don't want to overstate the significance of the first phase of this trade deal, but it could provide certain kind of ambience to the World Economic Forum meeting, which is, after all, about trade, economic ties, about globalization. So, David, from the world economics perspective, how to engage with these two economies, and in what way? How would you be able to serve as a platform? What role would you, the World Economic Forum, play in this regard?
Well, I think it's important that the world's two largest economies work together and find creative and collaborative solutions. I think the IMF estimated that the damage to the world economy was nearly 0.8% of global GDP in terms of the trade tensions, causing slowdown to the global markets.
Yeah.
So we, like many economists, we feel that just because the phase one trade deal has been signed doesn't mean it's the end of discussions, and now more energy and more creativity is going to be needed in the next phase.
Chinese President Xi Jinping made a speech at the World Economic Forum a few years ago. At the time, people were very enthusiastic about the content of that speech and the attitude China has shown toward globalization and leadership. Now, things have been evolving since then, of course, in a very dramatic way all over the world. So, David, how do you see, from the World Economic Forum's perspective, China is today? And how do you see the possibility that we can make efforts so that the world will not be further divided?
I think it's very interesting that the words that President Xi said in 2017 about needing to learn how to swim together in the ocean of globalization still ring true today. Everything that he said in that speech about not turning your back on globalization, about further opening up, and that all the nations need to work together to create that shared destiny for humanity, all of that is still true. And if you look in the last 2 years, China has not slowed the pace of reform and opening up. In fact, at our summer Davos meeting last summer, Premier Li Keqiang announced that they would be advancing the opening up of financial markets by even 1 year. So in fact, China has maintained its commitment and its efforts to continue that reform and opening up in the face of a context, global context, which is more challenging and more difficult.
How do you see the science and technology, which used to be a common ground for human beings, and now at a very different stage, and how is World Economic Forum going to be able to strengthen the still existing ties about that area?
I mean, the reality is that technology and scientific breakthroughs are going to continue to fuel and to drive the world forward. I mean, that's why we've called it the fourth industrial revolution, because
That's
we
right.
do feel that it's a technological revolution, and it's something that is very difficult to master. It's very difficult to take control of. I think you'll see different sessions in Davos around preventing a technology Cold War and different things like this, because we do recognize that technology governance has become a sort of a battleground of ideologies and of economies and so on. Again, what's important, I think, is to bring the different voices together, to have them discuss, and to explore those areas where we really do need this interoperability. You know, it's not enough for these systems. I mean, can you imagine your self-driving car which stops at the border because it doesn't have the way to operate with the system next door? I mean, we wouldn't accept this, and so we need to pull the leaders together and to say, let's not focus on the rivalries, let's not focus on the competition. The strategic competition will already be there. Let's focus on the areas where we need collaboration, where we need global standards for safety, where we need, you know, because if you think from society's perspective, if you think from the consumer's perspective, you need to find solutions to these rivalries. So we don't see, you know, the technological competition going away, but we're trying to find ways of creating cooperation around some of these technology issues, and also fostering environments where we can talk about governance.
Congratulations about all of these wonderful ideas.
Well, I think it's also inspiration from China, wasn't it, Zhou Enlai, who said we need to work on our cooperation while reserving our differences. So we'll put the differences aside and we'll work on the cooperation.
You learn a lot about China wisdom. Finally, before we go, David, I know you're moving the World Economic Forum into a brand new office, so that's wonderful. And I wonder, how is the China office or the Beijing representative office of the World Economic Forum likely to play its role in the future?
Well, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our new offices. It's great to have you here for our annual gathering.
I'm in red about 50 years and the first visit.
And you know, it shows actually the growing importance, I think, of the World Economic Forum. In the last 5 years, we've more than doubled the engagement of Chinese companies who participate in the World Economic Forum. We've been very privileged to host senior leaders like President Xi in 2017. I think that reflects China's real appreciation and understanding for the way in which the World Economic Forum, as this neutral and impartial independent platform, can really help China with its global efforts. It can help be a bridge to China reaching out to the world, whether that's through the government side or whether that's in the corporate side. So many of the Chinese companies have gotten involved with the World Economic Forum because they said, look, as we go global, whether it's to the ASEAN region, whether it's to Europe, whether it's truly going global, we struggle with the way to work with government, to work with civil society, to understand these new markets. And so being part of these working groups and these initiatives that are working together with other companies, working together with governments, it allows them a way to build trust, or allows them to build relationships on topics that they care about in markets that are important to them. So I do see a bright future for the World Economic Forum in China, because I think we serve a very important function for China to deepen its engagement and to have more leader-to-leader exchange with countries from around the world. So hopefully this new office will be a nice place to receive our visitors from abroad and to host interesting events that will really serve that purpose.
David Aikman, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I appreciate
it. Appreciate it.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. Beginning from tomorrow, I will be in Davos, bringing you all the latest with the World Economic Forum at its 50th anniversary. All the in-depth analysis and interviews with people around the world. On behalf of the whole team here in Beijing, bye for now and see you in Davos.